Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the homeowners association that wants me to leave my farm. I didn't expect to be told to get off land my grandfather bought with a mule and a handshake, but here we are, standing in my own hayfield while a woman in a pastel blazer tells a police officer to remove me from her subdivision. I had morning dust on my jeans and a thermos of coffee in my hand. She had a clipboard with tabs and a name badge that read, Community Board Chair. Behind her, 3 skeletons of houses, actual houses with trusses, wrap, and the damp smell of fresh concrete, were rising out of ground that had, until a few weeks earlier, been crimson clover and fescue. In my head, I heard my granddad saying, "The land keeps the ledger." I hoped he was right. If you're already thinking, how did 3 houses get onto your land without you knowing? I'll tell you exactly how. Gaslighting with paperwork. A developer bought the parcel next to mine, a rectangle that stops at the line of sweet gums where my fence runs. He cleared it, staked it, and must have realized some mistake in his survey. Rather than fix it, he or the homeowners association board, depending on which email you believe, shifted their lines 40 to 60 feet for ease of layout. The problem with ease of layout is the same as the problem with borrowed sugar. It's only easy for the person taking. I'm getting ahead. My name is Nash. I work my family's small farm. It's not big money farmland. It's the kind where you rotate cover crops, keep bees, and sell eggs by the dozen out of a cooler on a folding table with a cash box. You fix what breaks and you learn to read the sky. My partner Arden jokes that my favorite book is the county plat map. She's not wrong. I've got it laminated and dog-eared, because in this county, if you can't point to your lines, someone else will. Back in early spring, I noticed a crew spraying orange paint near the corner where the old pecan tree leans like a question mark. I walked over with a wave and introduced myself. The foreman, a guy named Rollo, said they were marking for utilities. I told him that corner is on my side. He shrugged and said they have permits. I asked to see them. He said to call the number on the sign. I took photos of everything, including his shrug. The next day, I called the number. I got a woman who cheerfully said they were moving swiftly to meet closing timelines, and that if I had concerns, I should bring them to the community board. That's how I met the pastel blazer. Her name is Clarabelle. She stood me at the edge of the cut grade and told me, with the benevolent tone reserved for lost tourists, that my fence had for years been approximately placed, and that the subdivision's recorded plat controlled the line now. She said they'd sent a notice. I asked to what address. She read an address that wasn't mine. I told her that wasn't just the wrong address. It was the wrong road, wrong side of the highway. She pursed her lips like I'd tracked mud onto her rug. I went home, pulled my deed, and started reading. Our property description is meets and bounds. Oak stump to a rock pile to a bend in the creek where the water runs dark in July. Every call lined up with where my fence has sat since my grandfather stretched wire with a come-along and stubbornness. I checked the county's GIS maps. They matched my deed. I printed it all and took it to the county recorder's office to see if something had been filed that I hadn't seen. The clerk, a woman who's known my family since forever, shook her head and said the subdivision had recorded an amendment to their plat to correct Scrivener's errors last winter. That amendment nudged their boundary into my hayfield like a boot toe in a doorway. I asked how they could do that without me signing anything. The clerk slid the page over to me and pointed to a signature. "That's not mine," I said. She looked and said, "It's not supposed to be." It was the HOA president's signature attesting to the change. Not mine, not a judge's, not a note from the county attorney, just the HOA acknowledging itself. I felt heat crawl up my neck. The clerk, who has watched more than one land squabble end badly, clicked her tongue and said, "You need a survey stamped by a licensed surveyor. Then you need to talk to a lawyer." So I hired a surveyor, a real one, licensed in the state with a seal that looks like it belongs on stone. His name was Hector. He came out with a tripod and a calm attitude and spent 2 days in the sun and the weeds, following calls from a deed older than he is. He found the oak stump, now just a ripple in the soil. He found the rock pile, half sunk under pine straw. He followed the line of the old fence, the one my granddad set by hand. And at the end, he drove rebar into ground that felt like it was exhaling. He handed me a map with coordinates, a report, and a list of monuments found. He raised his eyebrows at the development. "They're over the line," he said. 49.4 feet at the narrowest, 63 feet at the wide. He pointed to the middle house frame where a future kitchen's window would look right over my bee yard. If they pour slab on that, it's an intentional encroachment. Not a mistake, not an oops. I asked him if that matters. He said, in this state, it matters a lot. I walked back over to the site with copies. I didn't bring a chip on my shoulder. I brought hot coffee and a let's fix this before it gets ugly attitude. Rollo looked at the papers and then at me and said, I don't get paid to read. Clarabelle arrived in a cloud of perfume and indignation. I explained calmly that their work was on my land. I showed her the stamped survey. She looked at it like I was offering a menu she didn't want. We have a recorded plat, she said, and we have 3 buyers under contract. That's not my problem, I said, still keeping the coffee voice. You can't build on my property. She tilted her head and smiled with her lips only. Don't tell us what to do with our property, she said. If you want to complain, take it to the board. I'm looking at the board, I said. She didn't laugh. 2 days later, I pulled into the hayfield to find squad cars. Lights, not sirens. Officers standing near the new slab forms. Clarabelle was there with 2 other board members, a guy named Quinn and a woman named Tia, both armed with clipboards and confidence. The officer in charge introduced himself as Sergeant Lindell. He said they received a 911 call about a trespasser refusing to leave private property. He gestured to the dirt under my boots. Sir, you're going to have to step back. I'm on my land, I said, handing him my deed, Hector's survey, and the county GIS printout. He shuffled the papers, looked at the 3 houses like they might weigh in, and exhaled. This is a civil matter, he said, default setting for anyone who has learned that talking too much on dirt can end you in depositions. Clarabelle pointed. Officer, he was warned. He's harassing workers and interfering with construction. We demand he leave. You demand? I asked. The sergeant gave me the look cops give men who are about to tip from reasonable to in custody. Do you have any paperwork that allows you to be here? He asked Clarabelle. We have our recorded plat, she said, and our HOA rules. I could see the sergeant weighing easiest path versus right path. It was getting hot. Rollo's crew kept working like none of us existed. The sergeant suggested I leave and settle it later. I felt the old stubbornness wake up. If I stand on my land and you push me off it, I said, you've helped them trespass. He stared at me for a long second, then at the flyers for Phase 2 grand opening flapping on the chain link. Sir, he said, I'm asking you to step back for now. The county building inspector is on his way. Let's let him look. I'll step back to my fence, I said, which is the line. I walked to the fence and leaned on a post my granddad had set before the sergeant was born. The inspector, when he showed, was a compact man who smelled like No. 2 pencil shavings. He combed through the permits and frowned at the addresses. He looked at Hector's survey. He called his supervisor. He slapped a red stop work order on the nearest frame with a piece of blue tape. Rollo peeled it off. The inspector put another on a post and took photos of the one Rollo peeled off. That's a misdemeanor, by the way, removing an official order. The sergeant saw it and put his hand on his radio. Rollo put both hands up like, hey, my bad. By sunset, I had an emergency consult with a lawyer named Mara who owns 2 border collies and a brain that runs 6 tabs at once. She told me to record a notice of intent to preserve rights, to file a lis pendens on the encroaching lots, and to seek a temporary restraining order. If you let them finish, she said, they'll argue for an equitable remedy. Good faith encroachers sometimes get to buy the strip or force a weird boundary adjustment. But if they know, if they've been told and served and they keep building, courts don't like willful trespass. Judges are people. They don't reward stubborn theft. I didn't sleep much. I printed signs and put them up along the fence. Private property, no trespassing, active litigation. I set trail cameras. I called my neighbor, an old-timer named Ketch, who owns the land beyond mine and uses a 2-track easement through my field to get to his hidden pond. He said he'd been hassled by the HOA, too. They'd tried to hang a chain across the 2-track, claiming it was now part of their walking trail. He'd cut the chain with bolt cutters and set it at the foot of their monument sign like he was returning garbage. He laughed and said, they don't know rural folks. The next week, the HOA sent me a notice of fine for parking my tractor on their common area. I kept the letter because paper leaves fingerprints. They also sent a photo of my tractor through the fence. The photo angle made the tractor look like it was parked on the moon. I wrote back through Mara's office. One sentence. We reject any claim of authority by your association over our property. We attached the survey again. Mara sent a cease and desist for trespass and nuisance and a demand that they remove construction materials from my field. We filed the TRO request. We recorded the lis pendens. The title company for the buyers started making calls. The developer himself finally surfaced. He was a man named Tate, who wore polished boots that had never been in mud. He requested a friendly sit-down at a coffee shop just off the highway. I agreed, but only with Mara there. He offered to make it right by paying me for an easement and offering me membership privileges in the new community's pool. Mara did that thing good lawyers do where they stare like a cat at a laser pointer. "No," she said. "You will remove the encroachments. You will restore the land to its previous grade. You will pay damages and fees. You will send an apology letter so that when we file for punitive damages, the judge sees whether you ever took responsibility." Tate laughed in a way he probably learned in a seminar. "Lady," he said, "we're closing on 3 lots next month. Nobody's tearing down houses for a goat farm." Mara smiled like she'd just found the last puzzle piece under the couch. "We don't have goats," she said. "We have bees." Then she slid him a spreadsheet of our damages. Lost hay yield because his grading had compacted soil, destroyed clover stand, broken fence line, time, surveys, legal fees. She included a line for value of use for each month the encroachment persisted. He blinked at the math. While all that was brewing, other threads tangled. The grading they did had poured water downhill during a storm, washing silt into my lower field and into Ketch's pond. I filed a complaint with the county stormwater office. An inspector came out in a yellow vest, stuck a metal probe into the silt, measured turbidity in the ditch, and wrote citations for missing silt fences, insufficient erosion control, and discharge without proper cover. It wasn't personal. It was gravity. Tate's site manager looked about as enthusiastic as a man facing an unexpected dental bill. Then there was my bee yard. Honeybees are calm if you let them be, but they need predictable forage and peace. The construction noise and dust threw them off. I found dead workers in a drift near the entrance of one hive. I called a friend who works for the State Department of Agriculture. She told me to test for pesticide drift, so I sent samples. We found traces consistent with an herbicide that painters sometimes use to clear weeds near foundations. It's not illegal to use, but it is illegal to drift it onto someone else's crops. Add another line to the damages. Meanwhile, the HOA staged a community meeting. Someone slid an invitation in my mailbox like a dare. The flyer said, "Open forum clarifying property questions." I went with Hector the surveyor and Mara, because nothing clarifies like a map and a lawyer. It was held in a clubhouse that still smelled like new vinyl. Clarabelle stood at a podium and said, "We value community harmony." Behind her, a slide said, "Boundary adjustment update." They had a PowerPoint. They actually did. It showed their plat's lines, bright and clean, and my farm drawn as a beige blob with a fence that, in their version, had always been wildly off. I raised my hand. Clarabelle called on me with the tone of a teacher choosing the kid least likely to behave. I introduced myself and politely asked if I could show Hector's survey. Clarabelle said, "Your survey is not part of our community records." The room murmured. Mara stood, requested permission to speak as my counsel, and said clearly that any encroachment onto my land had no legal basis. She referenced state statutes on trespass, injunctive relief, and removal of encroachments. She explained that their plat amendment had no power to move a boundary without the adjacent owner's consent or a court order. She did it without drama, just crisp sentences that landed like bricks. A man in the back, turns out his name was Vern, stood and asked if this meant his earnest money on a lot might be at risk. Mara said yes. Someone else asked about their HOA dues. Another asked if their property values would dip because of the farm smell. That last one was Tia, the clipboard woman. I smiled. "The farm smell is clover," I said. "The smell you're getting now is fresh concrete." A handful of people laughed. Clarabelle didn't. She declared the meeting over, which did absolutely nothing to stop the questions. 2 days later, we had our court hearing on the TRO. It was a beige courtroom with a judge who looked like he should be grading papers in a high school. And then you notice the quiet steel in his eyes. Mara laid out the timeline. Hector testified about the survey. The county clerk testified that no boundary adjustment had been recorded with my consent. The building inspector testified about the stop work order that got peeled off like a sticker. The stormwater inspector testified about silt in the ditch. Sergeant Lindell testified that the HOA called 911 claiming trespass by the owner of the parcel, which, by then, everyone could see was me. Tate's lawyer tried to argue adverse possession, which is like arguing you get to keep a stolen bicycle because you rode it in circles for a minute. The judge shut that one down. Adverse possession in this state requires open, notorious, hostile possession for years, not days, and even then, not against a neighbor who has been using and maintaining the land. Tate's lawyer shifted to good faith encroachment. Mara slid copies of our emails, certified letters, and the stop work order into the record. The judge's pencil stopped moving. Good faith ends where notice begins, he said. Then he granted the TRO. He gave them 14 days to cease all work, remove materials and equipment from my land, and present a plan to the court for removal of encroaching structures. He ordered them to post a bond. He set a preliminary injunction hearing in 3 weeks and invited the county attorney to weigh in on the 911 misuse. The rumor mill turned like a water wheel. Buyers tried to pull out. Their title company couldn't insure because of our lice pendants. Subcontractors slowed down because nobody wants to rip down what they just put up for free. Clarabelle wrote a letter to the community calling me non-cooperative and warning that the HOA would pursue all remedies. My phone buzzed with unknown numbers. Some were polite. We thought we were buying. What happens now? Some were not. I saved every message, paper, fingerprints. Because when you live on land that wants to be quiet, every insult echoes. There was the insult of being told to leave my own field. There was the insult of a faux official plat trying to push a fence like it was furniture. But there was also another insult that stung in a different register. The HOA had fenced in a strip along my 2-track, put up community path signs, and planted invasive ornamentals that leaped over my line like eager children. They claimed beautification. I saw a line crossed with pretty mulch. Ketch showed up on my porch with a thermos and an old map his daddy had drawn in pencil. He jabbed the map with a finger like a woodpecker. "They're fixing to bottle you up," he said. "First it's a path. Then it's no farm vehicles after dusk. Then it's fees for road maintenance on a road your granddad cut with a shovel," he hummed. "They don't know what they're kicking." He was right about the pattern. Within a week, the HOA stuck a laminated sign at the mouth of the 2-track. "Residents only. No agricultural traffic." They lit up next door, which I avoid like standing water in summer. With complaints about tractor noise, I printed the easement language that runs with my deed and zip-tied it to the sign. Then I moved the sign to my fence, where it now points at a cowbird. A young deputy came by one morning and asked if everything was all right. He said dispatch had more trespass calls, all from the same number. We walked the line together. I showed him the trail camera footage of a board member cutting the zip ties on my active litigation signs. He watched silently and then wrote a report. False 911 reports carry penalties here, fines and potentially probation. I didn't want anyone in cuffs. I wanted people to stop treating my land like it was theirs to adjust. All while this civil war in miniature was buzzing, life on the farm went on. My hives needed attention. A section of fence needed mending after a pine fell in a thunderstorm. The old well pump coughed and needed a new capacitor. Arden kept us fed and sane and reminded me to stretch my back when I got stuck short and tight from stress. We took turns sleeping light in case someone decided to move a stake by moonlight. Most folks don't realize how personal a fence is to a farmer. It's not just wire and posts, it's a promise. Every staple is a sentence in a language you hope your neighbors understand. It would have been enough if the story ended with a court order and a line restored, but people who build where they shouldn't often double down when told to stop. 2 nights after the TRO, someone drove a skid steer onto my field and tried to dig a drain swale to divert water around their slab. They did it in the dark, with a cheap headlamp and bravado. They rutted up my clover and left the soil looking like an angry cat had scratched it. My trail camera caught the machine, the truck that towed it, the face of the driver in profile. I gave the footage to the sheriff and to Mara. Mara filed a motion for contempt. The judge set a hearing, and this time his pencil wasn't still. He was tapping it. That's never good for the person who made him tap. The morning of the contempt hearing, I passed Clarabelle in the hallway. She fixed me with a look like I'd violated a dress code. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," she said. "You could have been a good neighbor." "I am a good neighbor," I said. "I'm not a good victim." The judge found the HOA and the developer in contempt for violating the TRO and issued sanctions: a fine to the court, payment of my attorney's fees for the contempt, and a stern instruction that any further encroachment would result in a writ authorizing the sheriff to remove equipment and detain parties responsible. He also referred the matter of the peeled stop work order to the county attorney. He was careful. Judges in property fights walk tightropes, but you could feel the tide turning. If you've never seen a subdivision try to unbuild itself, it's like watching a magician confess each trick. They carted off pallets of block. They removed windows stacked like dominoes. They lifted trusses with a crane that beeped in a key of regret. They pulled nails that squealed like complaints. What they didn't cart off were man-hours, hope, and hubris. Those stayed, sticky. Right around then, a plot line I hadn't expected walked out from between two new houses in running shoes. A woman named Liza, who introduced herself as one of the buyers. She'd put earnest money down on the middle house, the one whose kitchen window would have watched my bees. She looked exhausted and angry in the way you get when everyone tells you to be patient about something you'll live with for 30 years. I was told, she said carefully, that the farmer was trying to extort the community. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was an echo of a phrase I imagined rattling around a board meeting. I showed her Hector's survey. I showed her the plat for my tract. I showed her the wet boots I had from checking my ditch after their grading. She listened and then said, "I'm going to get my money back, aren't I?" I told her I hoped so. She cried once. Quiet, the kind of cry you do into a paper towel so you don't make a mess. She started asking questions at their meetings. She wasn't alone. The community had been sold a story about growth and amenities and elevated living. Now they were being sold special assessments to cover mounting legal costs and fines. People who move into HOA neighborhoods don't sign up to bankroll a land war. They sign up for a pool and a dog bag dispenser on every corner. When the board pushed for a special assessment to pay for the bond, the room hissed. Vern, the man who'd asked about his earnest money at the earlier meeting, started a petition to recall the board. Petitions don't fix boundary lines, but they do signal that people want different hands on the wheel. The recall took time, and while it churned, the county leveled their own punishment. The building permits were suspended pending resolution of the boundary and stormwater violations. That meant even on the non-encroaching lots, the lights were off. Tate's financing didn't like dark lots. He tried to shift blame to the HOA. The HOA tried to shift it back to him. Both tried to shift it to me. The judge didn't buy it. The sheriff didn't buy it. The county didn't buy it. And piece by piece, the shiny veneer peeled back to show the nails and splinters underneath. There was one last frayed thread. The 911 calls. The county attorney opened an investigation into misuse of emergency services. It wasn't about one call. It was about a pattern, calling law enforcement to enforce a civil wish. When you call in Trespasser on the owner of the parcel, knowing he's the owner, you're not asking for help. You're asking for a cudgel. In our state, filing a false report knowingly can lead to fines, and if it's repeated and demonstrably harmful, probation. Nobody went to jail, but a board member was charged and pled to a deferred adjudication. Community service, a fine, and a required course. Yes, really, on lawful use of emergency services. It's not dramatic, but it's the kind of consequence that accumulates in people's thoughts the next time they reach for a phone to make the law bend. I'm not pretending I was calm through all of this. Arden would tell you I paced the hall sometimes until the floors knew every step. I kept the beehives clean just to do something with my hands. I learned more about civil procedure than any farmer ever asks to learn. But in the quiet, when the generators finally stopped humming at midnight, when the dirt sat still and let the dew settle, you could feel the land quietly insisting on its memory. Lines aren't just legal, they're lived. When the preliminary injunction hearing finally came around, the courtroom had more spectators than usual. People love a story where a small farm faces down a clipboard. The judge entered, and the clerk called our case, and for 3 hours witnesses took oaths and told variations of how we came to have houses on hay. Mara was a conductor. Hector was a metronome. Tate's lawyer tried one last angle, a claim that a mutual mistake about the boundary warranted a boundary by acquiescence. Mara reminded the court that I had maintained the fence line continuously, had paid taxes on the full parcel, had actively used the field, and had immediately objected. The judge nodded and asked Tate's lawyer to point to any evidence that I'd agreed to anything. He couldn't. The judge granted the preliminary injunction. He went further. He issued an order of ejectment for the structures that crossed the line and set a schedule for removal under supervision. He ordered restoration of the grade and remediation of the stormwater damage. He awarded me attorney's fees to date and set a hearing post-removal to address damages, including the pesticide drift. He allowed the county to retain jurisdiction over the permit suspension pending compliance. He did not set fire to the HOA with words, but he did something worse for them. He wrote down facts in a way that future judges would read and nod at. Paper. Fingerprints. The day the crane came to lift trusses off the middle house, I stood with Ketch by the fence and watched. He sucked his teeth and said, "That's a lot of money going backwards." I said, "It's cheaper than letting the line disappear." He nodded and handed me a thermos. We waved to the crane operator, who, to his credit, looked me in the eye and said, "I'm sorry this got out of hand, man." I told him I appreciated his work. None of this was his fault. He didn't draw a line wrong, he just moved beams from one mistake to a flatbed. It didn't end there, of course. In stories like this, the final chapter always waits around the corner like a stray dog, deciding whether to follow you home. The recall petition succeeded. Clarabelle and 2 other board members were removed. A new board, led by Liza, the once buyer who refused to be fed a simple story, was elected. They reached out. They didn't offer pool passes. They offered a real apology in writing, with acceptance of full responsibility for the bad calls and a plan to work with the county to fix what could be fixed without touching my land. They also sent a letter to residents explaining that the special assessment they'd been told would fund community enhancements would instead pay the legal costs for a mess that had never needed to happen. You could hear the grumbling all the way down the gravel. Mara still had work to do, calculating damages, attending the hearing where the judge would decide between removal costs and punitive damages, confirming the permanent injunction, and dealing with a quiet title action just to scrub the lingering smudges from my deed. But the gist had set. The land story was louder than the HOA's story, and once a story like that sets, it's hard to unstuck it. The second half of this whole saga didn't arrive like fireworks. It crept in quiet, like dew, until suddenly there was weight on every blade of grass. I had the preliminary injunction in hand. The trusses were being unstacked instead of lifted, and the subdivision's big billboard with sunrise stock photos was changed to a simple, bland message about construction delays. The site settled into a heavy lull, the kind that makes you worry someone will do something rash after the quiet convinces them the rules have taken a nap. 2 mornings after the crane rolled off, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I don't answer those if I don't have to, but the voicemail preview flashed only a few words, and I tapped it open because something in my gut said, "Listen. Hi, my name is Dalton. I'm a subcontractor who's done work for the developer. I have information you'll want. I don't want to get in trouble. Please call me back." I called him. He answered at once, voice low like he was hiding in a closet. He'd been filing the stormwater logs because the site manager wasn't great with forms, and he was told to backdate entries, so it looked like silt fence and sediment controls were in weeks early. After watching a crane peel trusses off a house he'd framed, he decided the story would end with him holding the last nail and no paycheck. I told him to call my lawyer and meet at Mara's office. He brought a buddy from the site. Smaller, quick eyes, nervous hands. In Mara's conference room, they spread scans and phone pics, forms with dates that didn't track, checklists signed before any inspector visited, a spreadsheet showing materials arriving after boxes were checked, installed. Mara listened, asked who gave the direction, and kept her pen steady. She thanked them, requested the files, and said she'd forward everything to the prosecutor. The county prosecutor called the next day. She already had permit copies, my TRO, stormwater notes, and screenshots from a neighborhood group calling me a bully. "We don't care about adjectives," she said. "We care whether records were falsified and whether 911 was used to enforce a civil preference." She also flagged the HOA plat correction, asking whether it implied adjacent owner approval that never existed. While that spun up, I worked my field. A skid steer had rutted my clover at night, so I reseeded and rolled the soil flat. Arden found a state pollinator grant, seed and erosion fabric to restore habitat where development disrupted forage, perfect for the strip hammered by dust and drift. We applied with photos, inspection reports, and a note about herbicide drift. The coordinator called to say we'd been approved. Meanwhile, the HOA recalled its board. Clarabelle and her crew were out. Residents elected Liza and 2 others who wanted respect for the line and cooperation on dust and noise. We met at Mara's office with their new manager, Augie, who treated rules like guardrails, not clubs. They accepted the encroachment had to be undone and asked if, after a season of good behavior, residents could walk my 2-track by permission. I said I'd consider it later, revocable at the first hint of disrespect. The prosecutor charged the site manager with filing falsified inspection logs. He pled to fines, compliance classes, and community service teaching high schoolers how to install actual silt fence. An audit found mismatches. Final grading logged before rough grading, weekend inspections, signatures that didn't match. The county put the developer on an extra review list. Mara folded those findings into our civil case to show a pattern of seeking forgiveness instead of permission. At damages, Mara presented surveys, restoration receipts, lost yield estimates, legal bills, and photos of tire tracks across soil, plus notes from students who'd spread seed, context for restoration. The judge rejected the developer's constructive solution to leave part of the build, awarded our fees, survey costs, restoration, pesticide drift damages, and a monthly value of use penalty until compliance. He also ordered the developer to match the pollinator grant, paying to grow flowers where he'd pushed dirt he didn't own. We filed a quiet title action to erase doubt. The new HOA didn't oppose. The court declared my boundary as deeded and surveyed, and any HOA plat suggesting otherwise void as to my parcel. On the 911 misuse, 2 former board members paid fines, signed acknowledgments, and sat through a mediation where a sergeant explained that civil fights clog lines while real emergencies wait. By spring, we hosted planting along the fence. The science club, parents, and a few sheepish neighbors helped spread coneflower, milkweed, black-eyed Susan, coreopsis, clover, and native grasses. 2 weeks later, a green haze rose. Wildflowers set roots. Respect did too. The HOA's punishment became work. Open meetings, fewer petty fines, a boundary policy requiring independent surveys before relying on plats, and a signed agreement acknowledging my easement with limited weekend access, revocable if respect slipped. The court made the injunction permanent, added mediation before anyone calls law enforcement for anything but safety, and warned against self-correcting boundaries with machinery. The bees forgave us. Field-mended honey sold fast. Mara delivered the final orders and a note from the prosecutor thanking us for handling a property fight the right way. I still walk my fence when seasons turn. The posts hum like they're remembering. Liza called to say the HOA funded a small scholarship for kids studying agriculture, environmental science, or surveying. Name it after Hector, I said. Surveyors keep the world honest. A year later, a postcard arrived. I thought lines were imaginary. Now I know they're promises. I stuck it on the fridge, checked the hives, and looked at the fence the world tried to erase. It looked like itself, which is to say, true. HOA, I am the owner because the deed says so, the land agrees, and now, finally, so do the neighbors. Friends, thank you. See you soon.